Today's episode is a 2020 recap, giving you a taste of every single episode I've done so far. So I launched the Ebb and Glow podcast a little over 3 months ago. I launched it in October of 2020. And so far, I've done 14 episodes in total, this episode being episode 15. I can tell you there's been countless hours been put into this podcast so far, and this is truly only the beginning. I have big plans for 2021, and I'm so excited to bring it where I know it can go. If this is your first episode you've ever listened to, this is the perfect episode to start with because you are going to get some of the best golden nuggets from every interview I've done. The guest I've interviewed so far, it humbles me to know that there's so many of these stories out there for us to hear. And my favorite part of doing this podcast is that I have the joy of bringing these conversations to your ears each and every week. The guests that I bring on, they're real people, real stories. And I'm here to bring these guests to you and show you that it truly will be all okay, no matter how crazy the ride and the waves are. So let's give you a little snippet, trailer, taste of every interview I've done so far. And maybe you'll find an interview guest that you want to learn a little bit more of, and maybe you can indulge in the full episode. So let's get to it. Welcome to the Ebb and Glow podcast. I'm your host, Jenelle Tremblett, and I'm a firm believer that even when life doesn't go as planned, it is taking you exactly where you're meant to be. On this podcast, I'm here to help you finally release control of what you think you want and begin to just trust in the ebbs and flows of life. Each week, I will show you how to build that positive mindset, radiate with self-confidence, and cultivate an unshakable resilience. Let me prove to you that even when life ebbs, you will glow. My first ever interview was with David Hollingsworth. David joined us to chat about what it's like to experience a life-altering accident, be told you would never walk again, and how he took literally daily steps to learn to walk again. In the moment, did you have any idea what was happening?
Yeah, I was very clear-headed. I didn't hit my head, so thankfully I was wearing a helmet. But I never lost consciousness. I never blacked out. And there aren't any gaps in my memory. But what I do remember was the initial moment of impact, then lying on the pavement trying to figure out what happened, because I was looking up at the sky and I heard people yelling, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. And it took me a second to realize because I've got a helmet on, I can't hear what they're saying. When the paramedics got there and started checking me, they're feeling my arms or my one leg, and I'm thinking, and I'm wiggling my toes and trying to figure out it. Then I realized my right toes didn't work. And that was quite a realization to think, okay, what now? I knew it was bad and I knew I shouldn't move, but I didn't know quite what to make of it. But I was conscious the whole time. I never blacked out.
That's almost a scary part. You probably wish you just woke up and was told what has happened. The fact that you were conscious the entire time, that's almost scarier, knowing exactly what happened.
It did give me a lot of time to think about, okay, what does this mean? Is this something that's going to be permanent? Especially when the doctor said, I don't know if you're going to walk again. I've got a wife and 2 young kids. I don't know what that means to them. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to work, even though I work in an office. I mean, it's not that physically hard of a job. But I had to wonder about that and wonder what the other side of this would look like.
My next guest, Kayleen Johnson, joined us to chat about her recent decision of leaving the Latter-day Saints community and church, which she grew up with her entire life. She gave us insight into the views of the church and why she decided to leave. And it's a lot of programming. Again, like we said at the beginning, if that's all you know and that's all around you, you don't know what's right and wrong anymore.
Yep. Yeah. I really wanted to give a voice to the LGBTQ community. And so they were all people who had basically left the church. And so their internal scars dealt a lot with how the church has affected them and hurt them.
When you finally decided to leave the church, What did your husband say? What did your family say? What did the church say?
So I've been slowly pulling away for the past, I'd say, solid year and a half. I've been pulling away, especially the past 6 months. The reason I started pulling away from the church before was because I didn't like the way that it treated my friends. I didn't like the hurt that it was causing people that I loved. And it has seriously been within the past 6 months or so that I've admitted and allowed myself to say, I'm pulling away from myself too, because I've been hurt by the church. And that has been really powerful for me. I literally just made my decision yesterday to leave. Everything is so fresh because I've been going down this path of like, I've been straddling the line of, do I stay in, do I stay out? And for a long time, I said I was content in my discontent with the church.
That doesn't sound very good.
No, it doesn't. And so I've been straddling this line for a really long time. And I just decided yesterday, you can't stay over the line indefinitely. You can't. And so yesterday, I finally was like, hey, I need to make a decision. I have to decide whether I'm going to just stay in or I'm going to be all out. And I finally made the decision.
Next, I had on Sammi Reyes, a 20-year-old from California who spoke to us about her experiencing anxiety and depression at a very young age, why it's so common in Gen Z, and how to seek help.
I just felt all the emotions of my family so much when it killed me every day. Depression and anxiety run in my family, and so I knew it would pop up at some point. But the way it popped up in my life, I didn't really know what it was, and I never experienced it before. So when it came up at 12 years old, I just thought I was just having a bad week, and then that was it. Then it lasted. I know a lot of parents will say to their kids, like, I just want to take away all your pain from you. But everyone experiences some sort of pain in their life because that's what helps you grow. That's what you learn from.
And you're also starting to get into those teenage years. So family might be like, oh, it's just a phase. She's going through the teenage years. She's cranky, stubborn, moody.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know?
I mean, I wasn't ambitious anymore. I wasn't myself. I've always been ambitious since I was a little girl. And so I just always knew what I wanted. And so I wasn't ambitious anymore. I wasn't getting my homework done really quickly. And so I lived with that for a few years.
I'm sure even at 12 years old, you're like, something's up here. Something's not the same. Something's different.
Yeah, I knew something was up. I just didn't know what it was. I couldn't put a name to it. And also, I'm not the closest to my parents either. And so I didn't really tell them a lot about it. I just sort of dealt with it on my own. I carried on with my everyday life. But I was fighting pretty much with myself.
Next, I had an unbelievable conversation with my guest, Rish Mitra. He joined us to chat about his experience with childhood sexual abuse and removing the phrase man up from our vocabulary. We also talked about ego, victim mentality, and how women can create safe spaces for the men in their lives so that they can begin to open up about their emotions. Why are you so passionate about the phrase and the problematicness around the phrase man up?
It was a July summer evening, and I was in my house helping my 6.5 months old son change. And suddenly something came upon me, and all I knew that I just not feeling well and running short of breath. And I kneeled down, I fell, and I was like, I don't know, maybe having a heart attack. And then I realized that it was such a unique way of your old childhood trauma coming up, that I had been sexually abused as a kid. And now I have a son, I'm a father, and I'm his protector, I'm his guardian. What if I can't do that? And what if someone does that to him? So all of that was part of that experience. And to cap that off, I was in a rocky marriage, and contradictory to what a lot of people believe, men are abused too. And I think like there's a lot of that stigma around boys and men growing up. Man up, toughen up, boys don't cry. And that actually transforms to the other side of the gender role, just don't throw like a girl. right? Like that itself is pretty insulting, just like any other thing about the boys and men. Women are very good about this, and they're just like biologically and emotionally in tuned about talking and expressing and be there and nurture, and and men are not wired for that. And especially growing up in a society and social structure like this, it's very hard to break that mold, and it's easier to follow that. And that's when I realized that day, that when that happened, how everything triggered me back to my childhood, and realized like, wow, I mean, this is serious.
Next, I had on Karina Reeves, who is an intuitive mindset coach. She chatted to us about energetic magic and source energy and what all of that is, and then how to use it to become more present. She chatted to us also about gratitude practice, how to have more flow in our lives, the magic of breathing, and tuning into our feelings. Before we start, what's energetic magic?
Yeah, so it's one of my favorite tools. It is all about connecting to source. You've just told me an issue that you have. I connect to source, and I can hear the beliefs and stories in your subconscious that's keeping this loop happening. So I can hear when you're lying to yourself. And so sometimes I'll be like, that's not true. And you're like, it is true. And I'm like, okay, well, your subconscious disagrees. And that's, that's good information, right? So there may be a little bit of ego that comes up. We're very attached to the things that we know and our habits. So if you have a should habit, there's also a distraction that's happening from other things that are possible for you. Because if you didn't have that, there's some ease and some flow that would be happening. So sometimes our habits are also ways to keep us small. So you can feel a lot of energy come up sometimes around the loops and the things that are keeping us stuck. Because as we're stepping into bigger spaces, it also means parts of us are falling away. So how it works is, I'll ask you, you've told me what's going to happen, I connect to source. I'll start somewhere. It might not be the perfect clearing. Usually we have to sort of go little ways through. We'll sort of find our way through together. And I'll ask you something like, are you willing to step out of the story that, or are you willing to destroy the belief that? And you just have to lean into feeling a yes. And sometimes it can feel a little crunchy. And I invite you to think about how cool it would be to be on the other side. Ooh, well, if that's what's coming up and I'd like to not have my shoulds, then maybe I'll just try saying yes and see what happens. The truth is, you can pick up your beliefs again anytime.
My next episode was easily one of my favorites. And the reason for that is it hit home for me so much. And I know it hits home for a lot of people. And that episode was with Elisha Galambos around the signs and symptoms of toxicness in the workplace. My conversation with her, we talked about toxic workplace environments, how to spot the signs and symptoms and the red flags. We also talked about how to set boundaries within your job and how to say no without being confrontational. And we also talked about the importance of self-care and the benefits of taking time off from work. You mentioned earlier around the ideas of boundaries in the workplace. What does that look like when it's executed correctly? And what does that look like when someone does not know boundaries in the workplace? I'd love to hear your side of that.
Yeah. So have you ever worked at a workplace where they say everyone is family here? Anyone who's ever worked at a workplace like that, that's a really great red flag that your boundaries are being crossed. When your workplace is beginning to demand you day or night, when they're saying, take that project, oh, you didn't finish it today? Great. Can you get it to me by 8 o'clock tonight? Your work day is supposed to end at 4. And they're not giving you any expectations of overtime. Or your manager or your boss is continuously taking out anger on you. Or even when they're saying something like a Friday night and saying, hey, we need you in the conference room Monday morning at 8, without giving an explanation. All of those things are toxic and they're very passive. We might think of toxic workplaces as being violent or abusive or verbally abusive. It's not that. And when we have boundaries around that, where we're able to clearly state, hey, these are my working hours, this is what I performed, and this is what I'm going to do to accommodate you, but during these hours, this is the time I spend with my family. Or during these hours, this is the time I practice self-care so I'm able to be a better employee the next morning. I've said all these things, and sometimes they've been met with mixed reception. And it's okay if your supervisor or your boss doesn't understand it, because that's the time when you know you can begin to look for an environment that is going to suit you better.
This next conversation with Justin Sandler was, truth be told, another one of my favorites, and I got a lot of comments from people loving this episode as well. So Justin joined us to talk about his recent battle with cancer and his philosophy that got him through it. So Justin was pretty much at the brink of huge success in his career when he got his cancer diagnosis in 2017, and his career and life came to a screeching halt. He joined us in this conversation to talk about his journey and how his philosophy, Embrace Love Free, really got him through his cancer journey and also any obstacle that he faces moving forward.
And that was so crucial because as I stepped into the very beginning, embrace became the most powerful first step of not just going through cancer, but what I would learn later is of going through any obstacle you may face in life, is embrace. And that means you don't have to like something or want something or choose something, but you have to accept that there is a challenge or an obstacle in front of you. If you are not accepting of your obstacle, you are simply in denial, and that should be left to be the river in Egypt. Like you have to accept, you have to embrace, you have to look at it and say, hey, this is something that I have to face and I have to go through. And if I think anything differently, then I'm not going to be grounded firmly enough to actually face this challenge. And I had to embrace my cancer and accept it, even though I wanted to just forget about it and get back to work and start my next movie. And, you know, I had gigs with bands and I had things to do. And I'm like, no, I want to keep going. I don't have time to stop and go through all this medical shit. I have a whole career I'm working on. I was really, really feeling like I was ready to, you know, burst the bubble and get into the next level.
In your mind, you're like, this is the absolute worst time. Like, come next year, but not today. Right?
But yeah, I mean, I was ready. I would declare it. I was screaming, I'm ready. I'm ready to break in. I'm ready for the next leap, the next plateau. And what's really, you know, in retrospect is that I was ready for the next level. It just, once again, it was, you know, it wasn't what I was expecting. And that's how life is. I was ready and I got what I was ready for. I was ready to face this challenge, which was the next step of my life. So embracing that I had this challenge, and then embracing the fact that I had to go and do the chemo.
My next episode with Jen Fontanilla was popular amongst a lot of my friends. They loved it, and I also got a lot of comments on this one. In Jen's story, she talked about her money issues that she dealt with throughout her marriage and ultimately led to a divorce. She also talked to us about a real estate mistake where her husband owned the home legally, but she was paying for it all, even though she wasn't living in it. Jen was awesome to chat with, and I learned a lot about money and relationships while talking with her. Obviously, money gets brought up a lot, especially at the end when you're starting to divide assets and starting to divide bank accounts. What did you experience when you were going through the divorce and figuring out how to split up everything?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. My horror story all stems from the real estate that we own. So I'm in Southern California, so homes are not cheap here, for one thing. And we had multiple properties at the time. And so I think it's really important that when you're purchasing something like a home, you really need to understand the rules. You need to understand title, who is on the loan, all those things, all those details, have the information, have the account numbers, understand who has ownership, who's going to be responsible. Because I'm telling you, divorce can be really, really ugly. And the person that you thought you were going to spend the rest of your life with, all of a sudden can potentially become your worst enemy. And so when that happened in my situation, you're so clouded. It is so crazy. It was such a confusing time because you're going through something so emotionally devastating, and then you're trying to handle finances and legalities and whatnot, and it's an ugly mess. And so in my situation, he ended up being on title. I was stuck on the loan. I had no ownership. but I was responsible for the house and I wasn't even living in it anymore. I mean, it was a mess. It was an absolute mess. If you are going through that situation, or if it happens, get professional help, get an attorney, get, a real estate expert, get the people you need, because there were things like, when the dust settled years later, I went back to see, okay, what could I have done? Oh my goodness, so many mistakes. How did this paperwork go through? So much time had already passed by then. I was just like, forget it. Like, let me just cut my losses and just be done with this. I'm telling you what happened to me so that you understand the importance of why you need to prepare and how important it is to be proactive so that you're not reactive. Because there's a lot of times when there's timelines and deadlines that you have to meet. And when you're in confusion, let's say it was a death and you're mourning, you're not thinking straight. I promise you, I don't care how intelligent you are not thinking straight. And that is when you make tons and tons of mistakes.
Next up was Becky Kukula. Becky joined us to chat about her experience growing up with dwarfism and her personal struggles navigating university and the corporate world with a disability. Becky gave us a taste of what people with a disability go through in the workplace and how often discrimination happens during the hiring process. She also told us what we can do when trying to push ideas of diversity and inclusion forward within our own companies.
In your experience working in that role or working in any of your roles, who is it in the organization that needs to put a foot down or come forward with an idea that's actually going to implement the change? I like what you said, the people receiving the roles almost had to stand up and be like, no more. But there's also someone in a C-suite room who has to stand up, and why aren't they, in your opinion?
It has to come from the CEO, the head of a company, the head of a corporation. I heard this story about the late Rick Finkelstein, who was a wheelchair user, and he was the chief operating officer of Universal Pictures for many years. And he would just kind of hide behind his desk and didn't embrace his disability. And it was unknown that there was someone at such a high level who had a physical disability. And that affected how the rest of the company operated because they weren't influenced by his perspective and contribution to the organization because he didn't want them to, but that put them backwards. And I think it's really important. I always use the example of corporations like Microsoft, where Satya Nadella, the CEO, openly talks about his children with disabilities. And now accessibility and disability inclusion is embedded in every part of their organization. It's not just the diversity and inclusion department, the HR department. Every single department of that organization has a disability inclusion component. And that's where we need to go. We need to be at a place where recruiters and casting directors aren't assuming that that's what the decision makers want. They need to know that there are decision makers out there that you can turn the other way because they may have a child with a disability at home. They're just not ready to share that story, but it may be a moment that could influence them to share that story if you bring someone with a disability in and give them a chance.
Next, I had on Joel Hawbaker from Alabama, who spoke to us about the challenges of navigating a blended family dynamic. So Joel was a child of divorce himself and then found himself divorced with 2 kids in his 20s. Joel learned the hard way that your ex-spouse doesn't naturally do everything you want them to do. So he had to find ways to create a successful environment of co-parenting for his 2 daughters and making his ex-wife an ally and not an enemy. Joel joined us to talk about navigating the challenges of blended family, how to create a successful co-parenting relationship, and we also touched on a better leadership style of servant leadership.
The hard part today is kind of like with you and with me. A lot of kids come into a classroom now from blended families, and that is a different dynamic. So when a kid comes in, it's helpful to know, did they come from mom's house or dad's house? Because they're coming from very different environments depending on what their blended family
and their attitude is going to match that.
That's exactly right.
They already have an attitude if everything at home was perfect.
That's right. And so like I've got one kid who comes in, his mom and dad are divorced. Mom is not married. Dad is remarried and has other kids with second wife. Well, it's a very different dynamic if he's coming from a home where he's the only kid or if he's coming from a home where he's 1 out of 3. And it's also a question of, when a kid comes in, hey, I left my textbook at mom's house last week and dad hasn't let me go pick it up or whatever. You know what I mean? Or mom, just
It's such a tough position to be in. There's
Yeah,
so
it's-
much pressure on a kid
Yeah.
to have to go explain that to a teacher. It's like you can't expect a 13-year-old to balance mom and dad's whatever argument they just got in this week. It's like, sorry, I don't have homework because my parents are children.
Yeah. Well, and the other hard part about that too is a lot of teachers, especially that are older than I am, didn't come from, it was a lot less common. Well, you know, I graduated high school in 2000, and I remember graduating with, tiny high school. I graduated class. I think 2-3 of our parents were divorced. I can think of 3 for certain out of 14. Today, in my class of 14 kids, I teach at a small Christian school. It's 8 or 9 out of 14 that come from that kind of background.
It's more normal than not now.
That's exactly right. It's over half. And so there's a lot of new challenges that come with that teachers, I believe, are not as equipped for if they're not used to it. So one of the things that I'm starting to do, in addition to working with couples, I do blended family coaching, that kind of thing. One of the other things I'm really wanting to do is to start doing training for teachers and school boards and things like that to let them know, hey, just FYI, 21st century student doesn't just mean a kid who's good with computers. 21st century student also means they're coming from a drastically different home life than kids who were born in the 1980s, 90s, and even the earliest of the 2000s. But these kids that are born in like 2005 and after, it's a whole different breed. They've grown up with smartphones and smartwatches. They don't know any life before YouTube and Wikipedia. And there's a better than average chance mom and dad aren't married anymore. And so you have to take those into account.
An interesting recipe. Earlier this month, I had on guest Shari Ware, all the way from Australia, to talk about her experience with obesity and limiting beliefs. So Shari was close to 400 pounds at one point, and she spoke to us about her weight release journey of losing majority of that weight. But she talks to us about how she didn't really start losing the weight until she realized the weight was because of her limiting beliefs. That's when she finally started making the progress. As we know, losing weight is not always just about eating less and moving more. A lot to do with the stress and emotional issues that we're dealing with. And Shari talked a lot about that in our conversation.
Stress is actually healthy for us to have a bit of stress, because how do we learn to deal with it if we don't have it? It is good for our body. However, we're not talking about chronic stress. Chronic stress in any form is not good for our body, and especially not if it's long term. So we definitely want to reduce that as much as possible, whether it be lack of sleep or any of the other forms of stress that we have in our life. And my biggest form of stress was my lack of sleep.
Yeah, I know lots of people that eat much cleaner than a lot of people I know, and they can never seem to lose weight or get healthier. It's hard to tell them that it's probably your lack of sleep and your stress levels, especially as women. Yeah, the sleep and the stress affects our hormones so much. I feel like our body is going to start adding armor to us and padding. And that's a lot of the times where the weight is coming from,
Yeah, well, Louise Hay said it perfectly, and that is that excess weight is simply a physical manifestation of a much deeper issue. There can be lots of issues that cause it. And the biggest thing I really, really dislike is the shame and the judgment that overweight people get so often. And most people believe what they've always been told, and that's that they're just not eating right, that they're not moving enough, and that they're doing everything wrong. And quite often that's not the case. It's not even about the weight. It's about health, because you can be super skinny and not be healthy inside. You just don't have the physical manifestation of what the inside of your body looks like. I'm still not super small, but I know that my body inside is healthy and that my mind is healthy. And that's what's really important to me these days. I'm not so much concerned about the number on the scales. It started out as a weight loss journey for me. It became a weight release journey, and now it's a health journey.
Getting furloughed or laid off this year was a common theme for many of us. My guest, Sophia Lorena, was impacted by this as well. During her 10-week furlough, Sophia created her own podcast and realized that there's truly no such thing as job security. Between that and being in a car accident, all in the span of 6 months, Sophia really saw her life put in perspective and developed a fuck it theory where she decided to finally start going after everything she wanted in life and to stop playing small.
Because if it would have drifted into the left side of the road, there's all this incoming traffic going in the other direction. So if my car would have drifted, got hit right on by incoming traffic, who knows what would have happened? Like, who knows where that would have ended up? Another crazy part about the story is the hospital where I was born at. It was like, you can walk to it. So I don't know if that was supposed to symbolize some type of rebirth, some type of realization, but that part I realized afterwards. So I get out of my car and I really wanted to yell at this lady. Like, I really wanted to give her like all my opinions. And I get out of the car and I sit down on the cement. And I realized, if I yell at this lady right now, is it really going to take back that minute that just happened? Is it really going to fix anything? No. It's just going to add fire to the situation. It's not going to fix anything. So why is it even worth wasting the energy yelling at this lady when that doesn't do anything? Let's call AAA. Let's sit down on the ground. Let's be grateful that nothing happened to you. Nothing happened to the other lady. Your cars were damaged, but that can be fixed. And let's just sit down and be okay with it. But that was quite a realization moment for me. What that car accident really taught me is that we never really know. You never really know when you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, because quite honestly, that can happen. I didn't realize you could just be in the wrong place in the wrong time and something can happen. And that definitely took a toll on me, on my sense of security in the car, feeling safe again. That was a whole different thing, trying to feel safe. That was a whole process in itself. But I think the whole big lesson from the car accident is just doing whatever you want to do now, because we never know when that car accident is going to happen. We never know when that last moment's going to be. So I think that was just really that, and being furloughed together. Those happened within 6 months of each other. So those were two big things for me. But I'm grateful for both of them because it really made me realize what's important. And the car, the damage, it's really not important. The fact that I was alive and the fact that I made it out of the car, that was what was important.
And finally, my last guest of 2020, whose episode I just put out this past Monday, was David Anderson. David talked to us about his faith and clinical depression. David had no idea there were ever two different types of depression until he was diagnosed with clinical depression. David always felt an underlying level of sadness, but never really thought there was anything that abnormal. David chatted to us about his road to recovery and how his faith and religion linked into it. In David's faith community, depression is often related to not having enough of a relationship with God. So it took a lot of research and discovery for David to not feel like a failed Christian.
They talk about believing God for something. Then that's how you use your faith. You find a promise in the Bible that promises what you want. We'll use healing as an example. If you're sick, like I had a condition called irritable bowel syndrome, which can at times cause intense abdominal pain. And I prayed a lot to be healed of that. I don't want to say it didn't do any good. I think maybe meditating on that verse, by his stripes I'm healed, maybe that helped me endure the pain a little better. But every attack was just another reminder I didn't have the perfect faith or the perfect health they promised. And the only conclusion to come from that is there's something wrong with your faith.
Right. So you're sitting there being like, okay, my health isn't right. And now also I'm failing at faith.
Right.
Where do you go from there?
Depression.
Seriously.
You get really depressed.
It brings up an interesting point, though. You mentioned in your book a lot where for your recovery, you needed a mix of your spirituality, but also your medication, you know?
Right. Yeah. After my diagnosis, the psychologist, of course, recommended counseling and medication. My first response to medication was, whoa, wait a minute. I don't know. That's kind of sounds extreme. But then he had just told me I tested high in every possible way. So if anyone needs medication, it must be me. And it did help. I noticed a difference pretty quickly. But it is an issue for people, especially if you believe faith should be enough for depression. Once you take medication, you're admitting that it's not. And I just had to be okay with that. And I had to realize God was okay with that. If you say faith or Jesus wasn't sufficient for your depression, that you needed more help, you needed medication or counseling or maybe group meetings or something, some people will be offended by that. And it's like they think Jesus is offended by it. Jesus is all sufficient for forgiveness of sins. He is not at all offended by that. I could not be a Christian if I had any inkling that he was. And so I still prayed and I still went to church. I still meditated. I still made that a part of my life. But I also incorporated some, medical science. And the fact that the medication helped me, I think, just further confirmed that everyone's depression is going to be different. Some types respond well to medication, some don't. But in my case, it did. And, I'm grateful for that.
And there you have it. All of my guests I've had on the podcast so far. And it's been an absolute pleasure. To everyone who's been here since day one, thank you so much for your support. And if you're new here, welcome. I'm excited to have you here, and I'm excited that you'll be on the journey and the ride into 2021 because there's lots of big things to come. And if there is ever a chance that you'd like to tell your own story, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to share it with everyone. So there you have it. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you again for listening, and stay tuned for next week.